Donald Trump is terrified that he will lose power after the 2026 midterm elections. That's why his Republican allies are trying to rig the maps for the midterm elections and silence American voters. My next guest, Marina Jenkins, is the executive director of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, the leading organization fighting for fair maps across the country. In this video, she discusses how Republicans are using gerrymandering to tilt the playing field against you and what we can all do to fight back. But before we get into it, please make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell to stay informed whenever new videos are posted. Marina Jenkins, welcome back to Defending Democracy.
Thank you for having me back. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you. I wish it was under better circumstances instead of seemingly the entire redistricting world is like blowing up all around us.
Yeah.
I know, look, you're like agreeing with me.
Yes. Agreed.
Yeah. So, before we talk about individual states, because Lord knows there are going to be a lot of states we're going to talk
Yeah.
about, I just want to kind of like take a giant step back and ask you how you make sense of
Yeah.
the moment we are in. I mean, you and I have actually talked about this. We're friends off air. That redistricting was never quite as neat and tidy as people probably imagined it was,
That's right.
but this is really something else.
Yeah, that's completely right. We have been what we've been calling a perpetual era of redistricting for some time. I think it was 2014. Since 2014, we have not had the same national congressional map more than one cycle in a row, right? So the map, somewhere in the map, something changed between each congressional election since 2014. So we have been in this sort of perpetual redistricting cycle where the old ways of every 10 years every state changes is kind of out the door. A lot of that has to do with litigation, and sort of other sort of odds and ends of things that were happening in states. It's very different from what we're seeing now, which is this like national onslaught of mid-decade redistricting. This is totally unprecedented. And the way that it makes, the sort of rationale when you think about it is when we started, I'm the executive director of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee and its affiliates, and the organization was founded with your help and the help of so many, really amazing, stakeholders for us, including our chairman, AG Holder. And in 2017, this wonderful group of people got together and decided that we needed this organization to ensure that the maps were fair for the American people. Because in 2010, the Republicans had this, big effort called Red Map to gerrymander states across the country. And the work that we have been able to do from the founding of the organization to, 2022, 2024, got us to actually a really good place. We had in 2022 and 2024 some of the fairest maps that the country has seen in modern redistricting history. And so, what this is, what's happening now is Donald Trump's reaction to the fact that the national congressional map actually would reflect the will of the voters. And given how disastrous his administration has been and how unhappy the American people are with what he's doing, the reckless and chaotic actions that his administration has been taking, ripping healthcare away from people, masked men in the streets, shoving folks into cars without identifying themselves. He knows that the American people would put a check on his power by, voting Democrats into control of the US House of Representatives next year in the midterms. And so what we're seeing is the reaction to that and an attempt to, rig the midterms in his favor so that there is no accountability on his administration.
Yeah, and I think you make a really important point. It's sometimes hard, I think, to convince the American people, even people who pay close attention to politics, that the rules of voting matter,
Yeah.
and can be outcome determinative. And there is nowhere where that is more true than in redistricting, because the lines you draw can be incredibly influential. But it seems like what Donald Trump has ushered in here with the Republicans, um, has really kind of proven this point to people. Like, people, I think, are really getting it for the first time in a way in which I'm not sure they did. I mean, you and I have tried to bring people along on this,
Yeah.
but that really, it is what you said. It is an effort to rig the 2026 election. Like, it's not about rigging this congressman and preventing them from being office, or helping this congressman or candidate win. It really is something quite a bit different. That it really is a national effort on his part to make it impossible, or not impossible, but make it extremely hard for Democrats to win if they garner the support of the
Right.
American people. And that is, I mean, that should be terrifying to everyone.
Yeah, completely. And I think, Donald Trump is decreasingly trying to hide
Mm.
his desire to be a dictator, to just sort of explicitly say this is an authoritarian regime. He has started flirting with the like, he does the like, well, I hear people are saying,
Right.
and his most recent like people are saying they wouldn't mind, a dictator. It's so outrageous. And I think it really should alarm people that he really is not interested in convincing the American public, the American voter, that what he is doing is good for the country. He is actually more interested in simply removing any obstacles to his complete power. And that's very alarming.
Yeah. So normally I would start with the Supreme Court, and we are going to get to the Supreme
Yeah.
Court because there is an enormous case. Perhaps, in my view, the biggest case of the term, is one that you are deeply, deeply steeped in and following and involved in. But I actually do want to start in Texas, because I think that is the place where right now most people are feeling the most immediate alarm. They are feeling the most immediate threat to democracy. Again, I actually think the Louisiana case that we're going to talk about in the Supreme Court is actually a bigger case. But let's start in Texas, and start from sort of a little bit from the beginning.
Yeah.
Donald Trump says get 5 more seats. And then there is this very, very weird, and I don't have a better legal term for it, maybe you do, weird exchange that goes on between the Department of Justice and the governor and the attorney general and the legislature. Like, and all of this now is winding up in court. But before we get to the
Yeah.
court part of this, like,
Yeah.
what the hell went on in Texas?
So I think it was like in June, and we start hearing these rumors. New York Times reports that Trump is starting to put pressure on Abbott and Republicans in Texas to redraw the map. And the initial reaction, and being in DC, sort of hear rumors, and the initial reaction seems to be nobody wants this. The Republican members of Congress don't want this. Governor Abbott's not asking for it. Certainly the Republican state legislators are not looking for this trouble. And that's kind of the vibe, that you're not quite sure, A, whether they're gonna do it, and B, how are they gonna justify it? And then remember the devastating flooding that hit
Right.
Texas,
That's
and,
right.
the tragic events of
Loss of
that
life.
July 4th weekend,
Right.
right. And as families in Texas were still picking up the pieces, people still looking for their loved ones, grieving loved ones, children in a summer camp, Greg Abbott 5 days later issues a proclamation and says, yes, 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 we have to actually have a special session, not to deal with, emergency preparedness funding, flood funding, but to deal with redistricting. And the justification that he gives is, well, because, the Trump administration has indicated to us that they have some concerns about our map. And we then, after he's issued this
I was a little bit
proclamation,
curious, right? I mean, let's just
it
stop
was
there for a second.
very odd.
All of
Yeah.
a sudden, like, the Department of Justice has some concerns about your
Right.
map.
And like at that point, nobody, like, those concerns hadn't been made public. So
Right.
Greg Abbott is just like, oh, like, the Trump has some concerns. The Trump Department of Justice has these concerns. We have to address them. Okay, well, what are those concerns? Then comes to light a supposedly written before letter from the Department of Justice to Greg Abbott saying, hey, given, these, and they sort of like randomly pull at, various strings of legal cases that they claim, give them some legal basis. I mean, you and I know, Mark,
Right.
the Trump lawyers are not good lawyers.
It's
So
not,
there's a
it's
lot of
actually kind of
spaghetti
like
at the
our
wall.
our ace in the card is that they're bad lawyers.
They're really
Like,
bad.
just imagine if they had good lawyers,
Right.
Marina.
I mean, that's the thing that's like, you're like, well, like if I were in their shoes, up, and then you're
Right.
like, well, no, because,
Right.
and so
Right.
they kind of just walked themselves into an explicit racial gerrymander because the Trump administration, the Trump DOJ sends this letter and they say, well, we need you, Greg Abbott, to go and dismantle these 4 districts, which provide the opportunity for voters of color, black and brown voters in Texas, to elect their candidate of choice. And we think that that's a problem. So we think you should go and redistrict. And so then, in the proclamation, Governor Abbott points directly to, he says in the proclamation, because of these concerns from Trump DOJ, we have to redistrict. So it is just like very straightforward, very simple. They are saying you need to dismantle these districts because we don't like the fact that these black and brown voters get to have their say in those districts. And Greg Abbott says, yep, sure, we'll do. That's it. And so now we're in court and and they realize what they've
No, this is the
done.
best part. This is, hold on, you can't go through this
Not
because
too fast.
all of a sudden Ken Paxton enters the scene,
Yes.
right? The lunatic, like the complete bizarro of Texas. Ken Paxton, the attorney general, is now not on the same page as the governor. I'll be right back with more of my conversation with Marina Jenkins in a moment. But, I started Democracy Docket in 2020 to be the leading source of news, information, and analysis about what Republicans are trying to do to rig elections and what you can do to fight back. But the team at Democracy Docket needs your support. It is growing with more than 20 people right now. But by becoming a premium member today, you will help make sure they have the resources and the audience to do what they need to do to protect democracy every single day. The link is in the description below.
Right. That's right. Because, even Ken Paxton apparently realizes what they are doing is unconstitutional. Like it violates the law very plainly. And
Right. So
so,
his lawyers, like when you say the lawyers, like I already just said, this again is not like some normal group of lawyers. Like this is Ken Paxton's legal team. They are saying,
yeah, and so then they're like, no, 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 no. This is partisan. This is partisan. This isn't about race. And so you have the state making writing and submitting briefs to a federal court saying, "Oh no, 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 those people over there, those lawyers at the Department of Justice, they don't really know what they're talking
right,
about.
right,
What, this is all kind of like made up, and that's not real, and that's like, unsound and
right.
and bad legal arguments that nobody needs to pay attention to." So you have the state of Texas through Paxton arguing that Trump's DOJ don't know what they're talking about.
Right. So Ken Paxton's saying Trump GOJ doesn't know, Pam Bondi and her crew don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
And presumably by implication, the governor doesn't know what he's talking about.
Right.
Right. Because the governor adopted the position of Ken Paxton. And then, as I recall, like along the way, by happenstance, because there had been another trial going on, there was a state legislator who had like given sworn testimony that also seemed to contradict this letter.
Right.
And like that was a whole thing. And so like they've just made a hash of this.
No, they cannot help but trip over their own feet and trip each other along the way. And it's because, as we said, they're not good at being lawyers. And it's just so brazen and it's there's just no shame. There's no like concern that they actually make you know, half decent legal arguments about things and they just don't seem to be on the same page. And I think there's a bit of this, which is that this is like the top down push from Trump into the states. One thing that's been really interesting is how this is going to shake out. Well, I know we can talk about Missouri at another point, but this sort of adoption of this talking point that no, no, this is all about power for our state, right? So in Missouri, Governor Kehoe calls it the Missouri First Map. And the reality is these maps are being drawn in Washington, right? These maps are being drawn at the direction of Donald Trump. What we understood to be the case in Texas was that, it wasn't until a couple days before the public saw the map that the members of Congress who are going to be impacted by these maps saw the map. So these are not like homegrown, like this is, coming out of a desire within the party, within the state to take this action. This is simply Donald Trump coming in and bigfooting all of the state lawmakers. And so they like don't know what's happening and they
Right.
can't get their act together to actually make, thankfully, to make, a cohesive approach to this stuff.
Okay, so I want to actually talk about Missouri, but I want to emphasize one point you're making. People may not remember this, but Marina does because Marina and I talked about it at the time. It was very odd and unusual. And in fact, I couldn't think of another time that it ever happened when the governor of Florida, Ron
Mm,
DeSantis, essentially vetoed a map passed by
yeah,
the Republican legislature in Florida. And this now goes back a few years. This goes back to the beginning of the map that is currently in Florida. And one of the things that, everyone needs to know, like Marina and I were talking about this at the time, because like usually these redistricting maps really are from the bottom up. Like
right.
they literally, like the legislators care enormously about these maps. Like they care more than the governors, and they sure as hell care more than anyone in Washington D.C. in the White House, right? I
Yeah.
mean, like so this is usually like one of these prerogatives that is like super important to the people on the ground, and then they get sort of progressively less important, which is why it was even sort of a breach or a really unusual thing for a governor to care more than the legislature.
Yeah.
But now, Marina, you're making this point, which I think is like really people can't look past. Like it is unprecedented on steroids that somehow the the legislature isn't driving this, the congressional delegation's not driving this. Like this is literally being driven by the president and the governor. Like that's really unusual.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And the I think the Florida example was very odd because you actually had and we had I think maybe it was New Hampshire that also had some of this. Like you do occasionally have this sort of like intra-party fighting over what the map should look like, but it's the exception and it's not the rule.
Right.
And so yeah, I think and it makes it really hard. The other thing is, and then they they make these, bold statements about how important this is for the people in their state that is like utter nonsense. But then you have Craig Abbott like signing it, quietly by himself
Yeah.
somewhere in his home, when no one is there to look.
Right.
Governor Kehoe in Missouri
Right, so this is
again.
where this you've just teed
Yes.
up Missouri. So let's just talk
Yes.
about governors signing on under unusual circumstances. So you
Yes.
alluded to the fact that Missouri then followed suit, did what Donald Trump wanted, essentially
Right.
destroyed a district around the city of Kansas City. Not something anyone in Kansas City wanted. The business community didn't want it. Like this was not a
No.
Missouri first idea. Again, another thing in the White House. Tell us a little bit about how this played out.
Yeah, I mean, you're pointing to a really important point again, which is that the people of Missouri don't want this. They didn't want this. They split Kansas City up into three different districts, connecting parts of Kansas City with rural communities, 200 miles away, fully across the state. And Kansas City is the biggest state in Missouri. I'm sorry, biggest city in Missouri. And it's the economic driver of the state. To not have a member of Congress like solely devoted to the interests of the largest city in your state really feels like you're not actually concerned about the people who live in your state. So that's the first point. And then, the second point is this was just, similar to what you're saying about like the Texas folks not having their act together and not being on the same page and sort of like making arguments against each other and undercutting one another. In Missouri, the sort of version of that was this sort of like shoddy way they put the map together where they actually put
That's very polite. Way too
I'm
polite. Go
I'm
ahead.
trying not to
Tell
I'm
people
trying not to use
what
that
it
word.
is, and then we'll let people vote. I wish I could do a poll, but Shadi's not getting at it. Go ahead.
No, they put 2 they put a precinct in 2 different districts. So either you have a malapportionment problem, because they should have put it in one and then the numbers are off, or you have like an island of a little precinct in one district that should be connected to the other. It's
I
just
like to
so
think of it as a new principle.
embarrassing.
It's one person, two votes.
Yeah, right. That is exactly what they are trying to accomplish. Yeah, no, I mean, it was just embarrassing. It's embarrassing. I'm embarrassed for them. Like I still apparently can have empathy for the Republicans because I'm embarrassed for them. It really is, and it just shows you just like how sloppy this was, how rushed it was, how it wasn't actually done by anybody in the state. The other piece is that, they're so anyway, so they pass this map, and Governor Kehoe's talking about he's proud of it, but he doesn't sign the map.
which
And
was
so,
weird. Which was
it was
weird.
weird. And these issues are coming to
He went on
light.
for days. He, like,
No,
for days didn't
weeks.
sign the map.
Yeah. And so then, like, a couple weeks go by, and then and the press has picked up on this precinct issue, and so he issues a statement. He doesn't sign the map yet, but he issues a statement that's like, "I feel really good about this map. Like, I'm gonna sign it." It's like, okay, then do it.
Right,
Like,
which
what
is
are we?
usually not the sign of someone who feels really good about something, right? Like, if they feel really good about it, they, like, have a signing ceremony, they immediately sign it, they, like
Right.
right, when you're issuing a statement saying, "I feel really good about this map, but I
Yeah.
haven't yet signed it,"
Red
yeah,
flag.
something's up.
Red flag. Yeah. So then eventually there are lawsuits being filed in the midst. There's an effort for a veto referendum, which of course, like the Missouri courts and Missouri Republican lawmakers are messing with by, trying to slow that down. We can talk about that separately, but and then just to get to like eventually he does sign, and my favorite sort of like commentary about how ashamed he must be of this map, that somebody, a friend in state said, he's not proud of it, and that he didn't want anyone to know or be paying attention because he signed it during the Chiefs game on a Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
So,
The
that's a
traditional
sign.
time one signs a map if they're very proud of it,
Right, right. No, just like on a Sunday afternoon, very quietly.
not public,
So
just
super
like
proud of it, apparently. Super proud of it.
okay, so those are, I think, but you will correct me if I'm wrong, those are the two completed Republican mid-cycle gerrymanders we've seen. NDRC and its affiliates have sponsored litigation, are behind the litigation challenging both of those. And so, I will give my 2 cents. My law firm at a disclosure is doing the litigation in those two states. Though I'm not personally, I'm not in an appearance in either case. Um, I think the Texas case is going to surprise a lot of people. I mean, because like you said, like it's like fundamentally they used race to dismantle a bunch of districts, which is like not allowed. And by the way, not just not allowed, it's actually the kind of thing that actually conservative justices on the Supreme Court would
Yeah.
object to. You know what I mean? Like people who are, before you start typing in the YouTube comments here, what about the Supreme Court? Supreme
Right.
Court's not a big fan of racial gerrymandering, and it is not a big fan, even conservative, or especially in some cases,
Yeah.
conservative justices. So that's kind of like my take on Texas, but that hearing is going to go on for, a while. So you can say a few words about that, but I'm really interested in what you think about Missouri as well.
Yeah, I know. I completely agree about Texas. And I think, one other point to add to the fact that even conservative judges and justices don't like racial gerrymander, they also don't like having their time wasted.
Mm,
And I
yeah.
think that the three-judge panel in El Paso that is hearing the Texas case now is the same panel that just spent 3.5 years
Oh,
like
interesting.
negotiating and navigating the challenge to the 2021 map that had just finished going to trial. I think the trial hadn't even ended at the point where when we started getting the rumors about Trump putting
That's
pressure in
right, and that's
Texas.
why this woman's testimony was so
Yes.
oddly timed, because there was a Republican state legislator who was literally had just testified in that first trial saying, "No, no, no, we didn't use race at all."
Right.
At the same time, the Department of Justice is sending a letter saying you impermissibly used race, and Abbott is saying we need a special session because this map was illegal because it impermissibly used race. And I'm sure this woman legislator is like, "Wait a second, I just testified under perjury before a federal
Right.
court."
Right. So the court is like, well, someone's lying to us, right? And if you're right, and then what do you dislike if you're a judge? If you're a federal judge, what do you dislike even more than having your time wasted? It's when people lie to you. And so, I think that the court has very little patience for what's happening right now, which we can see from the fact that they scheduled the preliminary injunction hearing a month out. You know what I mean? Like they were like, we're not. We're going to deal with this. So I think that's another reason, I'm looking to the court as sort of really not wanting to countenance what Texas has done. And in Missouri, I think it'll be interesting. This is the one thing I've been talking to people about, in terms of, okay, well, as we think about legal challenges and understanding that yes, we have a conservative controlled Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court of Missouri is a conservative court, and in other states will be in. But at the same time, the trend of the initial response, and we're seeing in other states, is resistance to this idea that the White House can come in and dictate what state lawmakers should be doing, even when they're all in the same party. We saw it initially very quickly. They folded in Texas. Missouri saw the same thing, some resistance. Ultimately, they folded. In Indiana, we're seeing a lot of resistance among Republicans in the legislature, and so it's I think an interesting question as to if you are a Republican judge,
Mhm.
you're not really subject to the same pressures and leverage that Trump believes he has on lawmakers within his party, right? Elected officials, folks who have to run for office on this, platform on the party ticket. And and where he's sort of determining, or he's now threatening to withhold funding from states who don't redistrict in his direction. And so I think there's a real interesting question, and I think this applies to the US Supreme Court as well, is in terms of in the context of what we talked about earlier, where this is really an authoritarian push. Like, are these justices on state Supreme Courts going to fold to the president, or will they have like some principles? And I think, if you are the mainstream Republican judge,
Right.
you should not like this. And so it's not part, at a certain point, it's really not partisan, and it is like the protection of our institutions. And so, I think that a lot of this is I have a lot of optimism because I still believe that there is enough of that backbone in both state and federal judicial chambers across the country, that we'll see folks being able to stop what's happening.
All right. So you mentioned federal courts, the Supreme Court, optimism, redistricting. So let's now turn to the case that will be reheard by the Supreme Court on October 15th. This is a case out of the state of Louisiana that involved a challenge to the Louisiana map that was drawn in 2001 that NDRC, again, was behind litigation that struck that map down as violating the Voting Rights Act. And the net effect was that Black voters of the state were given the opportunity to elect candidates' choice in two rather than one congressional district. That led actually to them successfully exercising that opportunity for the first time. And, the way I always frame this is that Black voters had in Louisiana, as well as Alabama, where you had also sponsored litigation that was successful and also led to a second Black opportunity district, that in those two states, Black voters had been suffering the indignity of having their federal voting rights denied. Like we can sometimes start to talk about this in terms of seat count, but like on the ground, what it meant is that Black voters were their federal voting rights were being
Yeah.
taken away. They were being denied their what is protected to them under federal law. So, just to do a little bit of stage setting here, there's been a lot of cynicism and skepticism about the Supreme Court. But as you point out, and I think people need to start with this as a baseline, everybody said that when you brought the Alabama case, that it could lead to the end of the Voting Rights Act, and it would lose. And instead, won in the Supreme Court, an important victory. Again, my law firm was involved in that case, and Black Alabamians had their voting rights protected. A few years earlier in North Carolina, again, everyone said this will lead to the end of the adoption of something called the independent state legislature theory. And you and your team, working again with lawyers at my firm, represented, I think it was the lead plaintiff, Becky Harper, in Moore v. Harper, the critical independent state legislature case out of North Carolina. And now we are back with this Louisiana case.
Yeah.
And this one, though, I have to say, Marina, feels a little different in that the court heard argument last term in a case brought by what they refer to them, I think, themselves as non black voters.
The
I'm just going to call them white
non-African
voters.
American voters, yes.
I'm just calling them white voters. You can call them what
Yeah,
you want. If they turn out, let them come tell me what, whatever. But anyway, a group of white voters, I'm going to say, challenging this map that was put in place to protect the federal voting rights of black voters. This got heard last term by the Supreme Court, and this should have been an easy one. And the Supreme Court
yeah,
should have just rejected this. Instead, they set it for rehearing, which is relatively unusual. And that rehearing will take place on October 15th. So, number one, did I get anything wrong? Number two, if I either whether I did or I didn't, and you can correct me if I did, how are you thinking about this
yeah,
case?
yeah. No, that you got it all right. And I will say this case does feel a little bit different. We have, as an organization, we have had a lot of success at the Supreme Court, working with the Alliance Law Group and the lawyers
You've
in the
had
firm.
unanimous success as a Supreme
We
Court.
we have had
Like,
we have had
yes,
great success,
yes.
which I think is sometimes surprising to people. But the reality is that the cases that we bring are when you have law and legal precedent that has been in place for decades, and you have facts that very clearly put together with that law show that there is a violation of law happening. It should not be controversial. It should not be like you can interpret this a different way, right?
And
And
that's why
so,
you're optimistic about Texas, right? That's why you and I
right,
are both optimistic about
right.
Texas.
It's very plain. Like you and so you do really have to go out of your way as a jurist, as a justice of the Supreme Court, to find something different, right? To rule against us, to find something different. And I think the judges in Texas, I feel the same way. And we have seen a lot of the Supreme Court going out of their way. And this is where I feel I this case makes me nervous because I sat in the springtime in the argument the first time the court heard this case, and you could tell they were the conservative justices were so frustrated that the case, which was a racial gerrymandering challenge by white voters saying white voters are being discriminated against in this map, and what the conservative justices wanted the lawyers in the room to be arguing about was whether or not enforcement of Section 2 violates the US Constitution. But that's not what that case was about, and that's not what was argued in the case. And you had even, the Louisiana attorneys and even the attorneys for the white voters who brought the case responding to questions from the court saying that's not what was argued. That's not like there's nothing in this case that addresses that question. And so, when we get to the end of June, it's the very last day of the term, we're waiting on pins and needles for a decision in that case. And you get this perfunctory, order from the court saying, oh, we're going to relist this case and we're going to have another question and we'll let you know when both of those things happen. And then just like weeks went by. And eventually you do get this new question presented that the court asks. And it is a very straightforward, does Section 2 violate the US Constitution?
Right.
Now, you mentioned our Alabama case. That decision is 2 years old. This is not like should we overturn something that is 20 years old. This is a decision that's 2 years old. And in that case, they rejected the state's argument that Section 2 was in tension with the US Constitution. Remember, the Voting Rights Act is legislation designed to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? So the idea that the legislation that was designed multiply, reauthorized by multiple Congresses to be the enforcement mechanism for those amendments is somehow in tension with those amendments is, a pretty outrageous statement. Um, which isn't to say that, Justice Thomas won't very quickly reach that conclusion. The question is, will Kavanaugh get there? Where is Roberts going to be? What is, Amy Coney Barrett going to do? And so, I think, the other piece of it that is interesting, and I think a lot of people want to make comparisons to the Shelby County decision, and and this like
That was going to be my next question. Shelby
right,
County versus Holder, for people who don't know, this was the 2013 decision that gutted another provision, so-called Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So, Marina, go ahead.
yeah, and I think that Kavanaugh in particular has been interested in this idea of time limits, right? That and the Section 5 argument or and really what happened was that section 5 wasn't struck down, it was the coverage formula for section 5, right? And so the court saying, well, it's fine to do this, but you haven't reassessed whether these particular states that are covered by the preclearance requirement should still be covered, right? The distinction between section 5 and section 2 is that section 2 has built within it a pretty comprehensive test to determine whether or not these protections are still required. This is why you see Section 2 litigation in states across the South and not in Wisconsin, right? Like the
Where it
reason,
technically would apply, so that everyone's
right,
clear. Like Section 2 does not suffer from the coverage formula criticism that Republicans and conservative justices made, because as the Chief Justice noted in the Shelby County decision, Section 2 has nationwide coverage. So in theory, if you had a history of discrimination in Minnesota, it would be covered,
right.
under, if it met the other preconditions of Section 2.
Right.
It doesn't single out individual states.
Right, but the point being that yes, and the point being that within each case you have to prove
Right.
that it should apply, right? And so these cases are, very rigorous exercises in, not only the sort of, 3-point framework, what are called the jingles preconditions about, is there a numerous and sufficiently compact population, and there's racially polarized voting, but then there are what are called the Senate factors. And these factors look at, like, are there still, you know, political campaigns that are using race baiting, right? Like, is there still modern day evidence that we have problems to overcome and that these communities, the Black community in Louisiana, um, cannot effectively participate in the political process without these protections. And so each case you have to prove that. So this idea that you can sort of say, well, it's just like been too long, and so we shouldn't have this law anymore. It feels uh, just like disjointed from reality and the reality of how these cases are litigated and how you prove what's happening. And so and I think that that's why we got the decision we did in Alabama, which is to say, like, section 2 should still apply in Alabama. Alabama still has a lot of, you know, challenges with racial discrimination that it needs to overcome. And like that is still their reality. And so this idea that you should paint with a broad brush to do away with these protections is really, inappropriate in my view.
Yeah, and look, I want to make a few points on this from my own standpoint. The first is, um, the text of the 15th Amendment, which is true, by the way, of the others that Marina listed, gives Congress explicitly, like it actually says in the law. So this is not me like inferring that Congress has this power. It actually says in the law that Congress has the power to enact legislation to effectuate these amendments. And Congress did that. And so, in some sense, the thing that has always struck me about whether it's Shelby County or this case or cases like it is, you know, for a group of justices who claim to be originalists and textualists, like I think it was pretty clear what, in the aftermath of the Civil War, the framers of these amendments meant, which is that they intended to let Congress do what Congress wanted to do and what it thought was necessary to effectuate this. And the idea that judges or justices think it's been too long, well, that like fundamentally,
Right.
one could agree with Justice Kavanaugh or any of the justices that they think it's been too long. But the remedy for that is to go to Congress and convince
Right.
Congress that it's been too long. In other words, it's not a constitutional principle for the court. That's just a legislative judgment. And sure, people may have opinions too long, too short, to this, to that. But like the Constitution gives Congress that authority. It doesn't give that authority to anyone else. So that's number one. Number two, I think, and I do want you to address this because I don't want people to misunderstand. Um, to overturn Section 2, they don't just have to overturn a recent precedent. They have to
Mhm.
overturn a lot of precedent.
Mm,
Like,
mhm.
yes, it is true that they would be overturning Alabama, which is only 2 years old, but they would be overturning, I don't know, I haven't added
Yeah.
it up, but a dozen cases, two
Yeah.
dozen cases before that have been decided by the Supreme Court, going back all the way at least to 1982, I
Yeah.
think, 1983,
Yeah.
right? I mean, this is a precedent that has been affirmed over and over and over again. And yes, it has been reaffirmed by this composed Supreme Court very recently. But
Right.
but boy, that was in a long line of cases that they would now have to decide, I guess, What? That they were always wrong, that they became wrong? Like, what,
Right.
Marina, what's the
Yeah.
theory?
No, it's bizarre because you're completely right. It is not right. Like we point to the decision from 2023 because it was a recent and because it's the exact same people on the court, right? Like you kind of think like, okay, well, there was a case like 10 years ago, but the court has shifted a little bit. This is the exact same people on the court. And so what has changed between now and then? But you're correct. Like, the framework that we use is a case called Jingles, which is from 1986, right? Like
Yeah,
this is we go back and even thinking about it from a purely ideological standpoint, right? Like the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized by Republican presidents. Like it
yeah,
used to get with just 98% bipartisan support for the reauthorization of this law. And so it is only in recent years that Republicans and conservatives have decided that they don't like voting and they don't like voting rights and that this is a target for them. And this is sort of like a totally uh we can we could go in a whole different direction on a lot of other subjects, but I think that like the thing that I pull up too often is, even taking it out of the redistricting context, is that this is attack on a multiracial society that
mhm,
we have and that it, has been, it hasn't been perfect, but we have been moving in the right direction for many, many years. And, I think it is important to contextualize this fight into the broader attacks in education within the government, right? This like anti DEI movement, right? This idea that anything that takes a lens to what's happening in this country through race is problematic, and I think that that's just incredibly uh, short-sighted, and I think it's incredibly harmful. And so I think, but again, like it's this like zeitgeist of the MAGA era that is like impressing upon the Supreme Court and so
yeah.
I just
I wanna build on that a little bit
yeah,
because I think that, and you sort of said this in passing, but I wanna sort of, like, double back to it.
yeah,
Um, the district in Missouri that was targeted
yeah.
is held by a black member of Congress, right? A man
Mhm.
who
Mhm.
long time, I mean, long time black member of
Yeah.
Congress. The districts in Texas, tell me about, I think, because you
Yeah.
mentioned this in passing, and I don't want people to jump past this.
Yeah.
When the Trump administration sent that letter, right, and they were concerned about coalition districts or whatever, they didn't pick white districts, right? They didn't pick members of Congress that are white are representing these districts, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
talk a little
No.
bit about that. Like, I think
Yeah.
you're onto something broader, which is this kind of like sense that like even when you are targeting for whatever reason, racial gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering, mid cycles, the results always seem to drive in the same direction.
Yeah, which is the dismantling and effectively if they have their way and we aren't successful in beating it all back, that the removal of members of Congress who are people of color, right? Like that is that is a very clear, very to me it is obvious because I think about these things all day. But you're right. I mean the intentional dismantling of districts where black and brown voters across the country are having their say of urban areas, right?
Right.
Like there's
Yep.
this other element, this other thread to tie together with everything else that's going on is like Trump just like attacking American cities and
Right.
this idea that he just hates
Yes.
people who live in cities, right? And so you get, Kansas City split into 3 districts, and, coincidentally, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus whose seat then is completely dismantled, right? So it's all of these things happening at the same time, and they are all, I believe, intentional, right? This is not like, oh, that's a side effect of what they're doing. That is part of their plan, which is to, you know, totally remove the power of people of color in this country and undermine their ability to influence the government and their ability to influence federal policy and the US House of Representatives. And you have that in Texas where they're, minimizing, cracking and packing communities of color so that their influence is diminished in that state. Same thing happening in Missouri. Same thing we're hearing, being threatened in Indiana. Same thing being threatened in Florida, right? Like it's like in Florida, like where are they going to go? What are they going to do? They're going to split Tampa, and they're going to uh, mess with Miami, right? Like they're not doing this in a way that is sort of like, oh, like we're just, propping up Republicans in urban or in rural areas. They are actively trying to undermine the influence and power of urban districts where primarily voters of color live, members of Congress of color serve, and all of that power and influence goes away.
Right. And, I want to turn now to some of those states that you mentioned, including Florida and Indiana. And maybe the jumping off point for you to tell us about what's going on in those states and what you see playing out is something that you just said, which is, the when Republicans gerrymandered Florida last time, which was already in violation, in my view, of the state constitution. What was the big fight? The big fight was over their attack on a district held by a black member of Congress.
Yep.
Like everyone needs to just accept this as like the reality of what's going on here. Like I don't think they should be dismantling any district. I don't think they should be dismantling based on in violation of the state constitution, and the state constitution prohibits partisan gerrymander, racial gerrymander, a whole bunch of stuff. So I'm not diverting DeSantis to do something else that's
Yeah.
unconstitutional, but it is interesting
Right.
that
Yeah.
when he had the choice of where to steal another congressional seat, and in my view, again, I'm not the court, violate the Fair District Amendments, he didn't choose to target white Democrats. He targeted, again, a
Right.
black Democrat's seat. And there is talk about this in Indianapolis among Republicans potentially there, although I think that's going to be like almost impossible. There is talk about this in Ohio.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
talk to us
Yeah.
not just about the race choices they're making, but
Yeah.
just talk to us more generally about what you see playing out in the other states. I listed three, but you should mention whichever ones you think are the most important. I mentioned Florida, Indiana, and Ohio, but you're the expert on this. You have at it.
Yeah, no, I mean, those 3 states, I would add Kansas, which is now
Right,
also,
Kansas. By the way, and what district are they looking at in Kansas?
Sharice Davids,
Right, another
woman of color.
woman of color.
Also Kansas City. So, like, both sides of Kansas City, there would not be one district in the US House of Representatives that would represent the interests of people living in either Kansas City, Kansas, or Kansas City, Missouri.
Right.
And, at least, the rumors is that so then you'd have this region being split up into 5 different, uh, 5 different congressional districts, which for a city like Kansas City, which is like big for Kansas and Missouri, but like that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And so yeah, so what you have here again is this attempt to completely dilute and diminish urban and diverse voices in the US House of Representatives.
Where should we be watching first?
So I think and I will add North Carolina. There's
Oh,
also
right,
like,
North Carolina,
this
right,
like
yeah, didn't they say
crazy
something about North Carolina recently?
right, that they're gonna go after Don Davis's seat, another member of the Congressional Black Caucus. And then we're hearing rumors of Trump putting pressure in New Hampshire, where we're hearing pressure being put in Nebraska. It's just sort of endless, and I think as Trump continues to, be have his popularity decrease and decrease and decrease, I think, the flailing continues. But overall, I think there is going to be a push in Ohio. Ohio has a 3-step process. They've just missed the first step, which is trying to get a bipartisan map out of the legislature. The deadline for that was September
They
30th.
didn't want a bipartisan map.
They didn't want a bipartisan map. So maybe, now in October, it's under the a redistricting committee, but that committee includes Governor DeWine. Like, it's again where it's like, does Governor DeWine want to own this? I don't think he does. And so, likely that is a November push. I think Indiana, we've also heard November. Florida probably goes into regular session in January to try and do this. There's sort of, I think, probably several more months, unfortunately, ahead of us of this battle. And then the litigation begins, and then it's many, many more months beyond that.
Right. Okay. So the question I always get whenever litigation comes up is people have internalized the Purcell doctrine into their
Mhm.
vocabulary, which is really remarkable since it was not that long ago a pretty obscure legal principle.
Right.
But for those of you watching this video who don't know it, the Purcell doctrine has sort of metastasized in a lot of ways. At its simplest, the way to think about it is you shouldn't make changes, courts shouldn't order changes to election laws in close proximity to elections because it can be highly disruptive to the electorate's expectations and the ability of election officials to run elections. So the idea is, don't go ordering, a change in the voter ID laws in October before a November election, right? And what's happened over time is this doctrine has become really embraced by a lot of conservative judges and justices, and it has jumped to redistricting, which, by the way, was not a natural jump. Like, it doesn't really make a lot of sense that it would apply to redistricting, but it's been applied by the Supreme Court to redistricting.
Yep.
And it has gotten the period of what is considered close to an election has gotten quite lengthy. Like the original, I remember
Right.
litigating Purcell cases. We were talking about like the couple of weeks before the election. I
Right.
think it was actually a case in Louisiana that you guys were responsible for. It may have been actually the predecessor of this case we've been talking about,
Yeah.
where they said like February before the election
Yeah.
was too soon. So tell us, like, I assume you feel good about Texas because that
Yeah.
trial is October.
Yeah.
How do you,
Right.
how do
Right.
you, how, when is too late? How do you
Yeah.
deal with the fact that Republicans may run the clock?
Yeah. And courts are able to move, deadlines as needed, right? And so in Texas, the court has said it is willing to move the deadline, which is another indicator, I think, of where the court's head is, and just in terms of being like unamused by what is happening right now. But it's true, and I think that it's there's a lot of like playing games with timelines, and you see this, right? I think that this is part of what was happening in Missouri with the governor just kind of like sitting on the map for weeks, even proclaiming that he was so proud of this map, and then just kind of sitting on it. And I think part of that was just it's like you're not actually proud of the map, and part of that is probably like I'm trying to play games because then I can slow this process down and try and get the litigation to go slower, and try and just so that you sort of throw sand in the gears for folks to be able to stop these maps from taking place. And then I think that in Texas, for example, our ability to get a preliminary injunction will be huge because then they have to sort of overcome that, and then say it's not too late, right? And so I do think this is sort of like a um uh I spent a lot of time with my grandmother growing up, so I use phrases, and my team makes fun of me sometimes, but I like to say, like what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? Like if they're going to
That's a good
uh
boomer phrase. Yeah, that's
it's
very
a good
nice.
phrase, yeah. Um, if Republicans can say like, "Oh, February to November is too short a time," then we are certainly way past the time when it is appropriate to be changing the maps ahead of
Right.
2026. Candidates are starting to, put their campaigns together. People are trying to figure out what's going to happen. Voters need to understand what districts they're in. There are primaries that are going to begin in, as early as March. Like things are moving. We are, very close to the next election cycle. And so I do think the timing and the sort of back and forth I think people need to keep an eye out for, the games that Republicans are playing around timelines, and then sort of how courts will respond to, okay, you said it was too soon before. How about now?
Yeah. All right. So first of all, before people write in comments, I'm Gen X. Like no one remembers Gen X, but
I
we
know.
are a generation. We're just stuck
You're
between the other.
there. You're there.
Real quickly before, because you've been very generous with your time. Uh, so we've gone through a lot of stuff, and people are really concerned. We talked about at the beginning that this is for, I think for those of us to follow it, and in the popular culture, people understand this may be the difference between free and fair elections and not free and fair elections and control of Congress. So what can people do?
Yeah, I think it should not be underestimated how important it is for folks to just be aware of what's happening, right? Redistricting, I do think like the level of general awareness about redistricting and redistricting processes in each state has improved over time, since our organization has existed. I do think there's a general increase in awareness around these issues, but I think sometimes it can seem a little bit wonky, but redistricting fights are so important. As you have laid out, just like the incredible sort of tangible impact on our representation at a federal level and what this means in terms of the future of our country, it just can't be understated. And so, first and foremost is talk to your friends and neighbors, talk to your family, just make sure people understand what's going on and what the stakes are. And then if you are in a state where this is happening, the public pressure is important. The public pressure on Republican legislators to not do this and not to bend to Trump's will, and the public pressure on Democratic lawmakers to, stand up and do what they can to fight this process. It's so important, and it is felt by these state lawmakers. And so, even if you don't live in a state, I'm sure you have friends and family that do. So, it is just so important to continue to get involved. The other thing I would do is to text action to 36787. And that will connect you with our organization, Action, to 36787.
There you go. Marina Jenkins, my friend, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.